The morning was a shard of ice. The kind of cold that freezes your breath in your lungs and makes the world seem like it could shatter into a million pieces. Maeve Hollister was on her knees, praying to a dying fire. Her fingers, red and split, held the last piece of kindling like it was a holy relic. This was it, the last one. Behind her, under a quilt so thin it was more a memory than a blanket, her children lay still, Hank and Rosie. Their eyes were open, but they knew better than to talk. Talking used energy, and energy was food they didn't have. Maeve fed the splinter of wood to the glowing embers. It hissed, a sound of protest, before a tiny flame, weak and uncertain, licked up into the darkness. She watched it, her shoulders slumping. An hour. Maybe, if she was lucky, if the wind didn't find a new crack in the wall to sneak through. Not another day like this, she whispered, the words stolen by the cold before they could even form. Outside, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow beat against the single window, a white fist trying to get in. She stood up, her body aching, and went to the small table. In a tin cup, there was a half-inch of water, already filmed with ice. She broke the ice with her finger and poured the water into a pot, adding a sprinkle of flour. It wasn't breakfast. It was a ghost of a breakfast, a pale, watery paste meant to fool their stomachs for a few hours. As she stirred it over the new fragile fire, Rosie sat up. Her face was a pale oval in the gloom, her eyes too big, her hair a wild tangle. "Is it morning for real?" she asked, her voice as thin as the gruel. Maeve tried to smile, but her lips were too chapped to cooperate. "For real, love." Hank sat up next, slower, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His question was always the same, a little knife that twisted in Maeve's gut every single morning. "Is Pa coming back today?" Maeve froze. She kept her back to them, staring at the pot. Her husband was gone. A logging cart, a steep ridge, a terrible accident. That's what they told her. But how do you explain that to a 6-year-old? "No, love," she said, her voice flat and steady. "Just us three." The silence that followed was heavy. It was a grown-up silence, and it was terrifying to hear it coming from her own children. She divided the paste into 3 bowls. Rosie ate like a little bird, making each spoonful last. Hank gulped his down and then stared at his empty bowl, his cheeks flushing with shame. There was never any more. Maeve wiped the bowls clean with a handful of snow from the doorstep and put on her threadbare shawl. "I'm going to town," she announced. Rosie's head snapped up, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Can we come?" Maeve looked at their thin coats, at their worn-out boots. "You'll freeze," she said softly. But she saw the fear in their faces, the terror of being left alone in the cold, silent cabin. She sighed, a small white puff in the air. "All right, wrap yourselves. We'll go together." The walk was 4 miles of punishment. The snow was deep, and the wind pushed against them like a physical wall. Maeve broke the trail, her own breath ragged in her ears, the children stumbling behind her like 2 little ghosts. She didn't let herself think about the cold. She thought only of the mercantile, of a sack of flour, of anything to keep the gnawing hunger at bay. The town was a cluster of gray buildings, huddled against the storm. The bell in the church tower tolled, the sound flat and dead in the thick, snowy air. Maeve pushed open the heavy door to the mercantile, and the wave of warm, spiced air that hit her felt like a miracle. Martha Pritchard looked up from behind the counter, her face sour. "Maeve Hollister," she said, her voice sharp, "heard you was near out of everything." Maeve lifted her chin, her pride a thin shield against the woman's scorn. "I need flour, Martha, and some beans." Martha wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes cold and hard. "You know what I told you last time, Maeve. I ain't a charity. I can't keep running a tally that never gets paid." The children pressed closer to Maeve's legs, their small bodies tense. 2 other women were sitting by the big pot-bellied stove, and they stopped their chatter to watch, their faces smug. Maeve felt their stares like little stones hitting her skin. "Just enough for the week," Maeve said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll settle up when the thaw comes." Martha sniffed, her lips a thin, disapproving line. "Half a sack of flour," she said finally, slamming it down on the counter. "And don't say I never did you no kindness." Maeve grabbed the sack, the weight of it a small comfort. As she herded the children toward the door, one of the women by the stove spoke, her voice just loud enough to carry. Some folks ought to think what's best for their young'uns. Can't raise children on pride and mountain air. Maeve didn't look back. She pushed the door open and stepped back into the biting wind, the woman's words ringing in her ears. She held the sack of flour like it was a baby, shielding it from the snow. The walk home was even harder. The wind was angrier now, and the sky was turning a bruised, ugly purple. They were halfway there, struggling up a long, sloping ridge, when Maeve felt it, a prickling on the back of her neck. The feeling of being watched. She stopped, her heart suddenly pounding. She scanned the landscape, a blur of white and gray, and then she saw him. On the crest of the next ridge, a figure stood silhouetted against the dying light. He was tall and broad, an axe slung over his shoulder. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching them. She knew who it was. Everyone knew about Boone Callahan, the mountain man who lived so deep in the timber that most folks thought he was more ghost than man. They said he was dangerous. They said he was half wild. She quickly looked away, pulling the children closer, and started walking faster, her boots sinking deep into the snow. But she could feel his eyes on her back, a heavy, unblinking stare that followed them all the way home. That night the wind screamed, and the cabin felt like a tiny, fragile boat in a furious sea. Maeve made a small loaf of bread with the new flour, her hands shaking. She gave the last log to the stove and watched the flames devour it. She knew it wouldn't last the night. The thought of the cold creeping in, of the children waking up shivering, made her stomach clench with a fear that was worse than hunger. She remembered the sheriff's last visit, his kind but firm words. Maeve, the county's got rules. If a mother can't provide, they might have to step in, for the children's own good. The thought was a physical pain. She had promised her husband on his deathbed she would keep their family together, no matter what. She checked the latch on the door, a useless gesture. No one ever came this far out. She stood in the dark, listening to the storm and the quiet, sleeping breaths of her children. It was Rosie who saw it first. She had woken up and was staring at the door, her eyes wide with fear. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's a man on the porch." Maeve's blood ran cold. She crept to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, and pulled it open just a crack. The wind tore at her, and snow stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles. But it wasn't a man. It was a stack of firewood, a huge, neat stack of perfectly split logs piled high on her porch, more wood than she had seen in months. She stepped outside, her bare feet sinking into the snow, and scanned the trees. The moon had broken through the clouds, and the world was bathed in a strange, silver light. She saw nothing. No one. Just a single set of deep footprints leading away from her cabin and disappearing into the dark, silent woods. Hank came to stand beside her, his small face full of wonder. "Who left it?" he asked. Maeve swallowed, her throat tight. "Someone," she said, her voice hoarse, "who wanted us to be warm." She knelt and touched the wood. It was cold, but she could feel the life in it, the promise of heat. When she looked up, she didn't look toward the town. She looked toward the ridge where Boone Callahan had stood watching them. She closed the door, and for the first time in a long time, the cabin didn't feel like a trap. It felt almost like a home. But as she lay awake that night, listening to the new logs crackling in the stove, a new kind of fear began to creep in. This wasn't just a gift. It felt like something else, a message, a claim, and she had no idea what it meant. The next morning the world was silent, buried under a fresh blanket of snow. The wood Boone had left was a miracle, a silent testament on her porch. It was enough to last for weeks. Pride told her not to touch it, not until she knew why he'd left it. But the sight of her children's faces, still pale with cold, made the decision for her. She fed the stove until the little cabin was filled with a deep, steady warmth. It felt like a betrayal of her husband's memory somehow, to accept help from this strange, wild man. But it also felt like survival. She was stacking the wood later that day when she found it. On one of the logs near the bottom of the pile, a letter had been carved into the bark. It was a single perfect letter, H. Her breath caught in her throat. H for Hollister, H for Hank, her husband, or H for Hank, her son. It wasn't a kindness. It was a sign, and it terrified her. What did this man want from them? Was this a threat? A warning? She pushed the carved log to the back of the pile, hiding it from view, but she couldn't hide it from her mind. The warmth from the fire suddenly felt different. It felt like a debt she could never repay. A few days later he came. She was outside gathering snow to melt for water when she heard the crunch of boots. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. It was him, Boone Callahan. He stood a few yards away, a dark giant against the blinding white snow. He had a freshly killed deer slung over his shoulder, its dark blood a shocking stain against the purity of the landscape. He just stood there, watching her, his eyes unreadable under the brim of his hat. "You left the wood," Maeve said. It wasn't a question. He gave a single, slow nod. "You shouldn't have," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. He shifted the weight of the deer. "Would have rotted where it lay," he said, his voice a low rumble, like rocks moving at the bottom of a river. "No use to anyone." His eyes flickered toward the thin curl of smoke rising from her chimney. "Seemed you had a use for it?" Maeve's pride and her gratitude were at war inside her. "We'll be all right," she said, though the words tasted like a lie. He took a step closer, and she had to fight the urge to step back. "Then take this as a trade," he said, gesturing with his head toward the deer. "I've got more meat than I can smoke before the thaw. You got salt?" She hesitated. The idea of letting this man into her cabin, into her life, was terrifying. But the thought of fresh meat, of a real meal for her children, was a powerful temptation. The way he'd said it, a trade, soothed her pride. It wasn't charity, it was a bargain. "All right," she said, and led the way to the door. The cabin seemed to shrink when he stepped inside. His shoulders nearly brushed the top of the doorframe. He laid the deer on her small table, and the room was suddenly filled with the wild, metallic smell of the forest. The children, who had been hiding under the quilt, peeked out, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Maeve got the salt jar, her hands trembling slightly, and set it on the table. Boone took a handful and began rubbing it into the meat, his large, calloused hands moving with a quiet, practiced efficiency. Little Hank, his hunger finally overcoming his fear, crept closer. "Did you shoot it, mister?" he asked. Boone glanced at him, and for a second Maeve thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "Arrow," he said, "quieter that way." He looked at Maeve then, his eyes dark and intense. "Your husband," he said, his voice low. "He was a good man. Fought hard." Maeve froze, the salt jar still in her hand. "Fought what?" she asked. Boone just shook his head, his gaze dropping back to the meat. "The mountain," he said vaguely. "It don't give up its timber easy." When he was done, he tied the meat and pushed a large portion of it toward her. "Boil the bones for broth," he said, his voice all business again. "It'll keep the children strong." He was at the door before she could find her voice. "Thank you," she finally managed to say. He just touched the brim of his hat and was gone, leaving only his footprints in the snow and the heavy scent of venison in the air. That night they feasted. Maeve made a thick, rich stew, and the children ate until their bellies were full and their cheeks were flushed. It was the first time she had heard them laugh in months, but as she sat by the fire long after they were asleep, she couldn't shake a feeling of deep unease. Boone Callahan wasn't just a hermit. He knew something. Something about her husband. Something about the day he died. And she was beginning to suspect that the logging cart on the ridge hadn't been an accident at all. The stew lasted for 5 days, and for 5 days the cabin felt like a fortress against the world. But the world has a way of creeping in. When the meat ran out and Maeve had to go back to town for supplies, she could feel the change immediately. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were open stares, cold shoulders. Martha Pritchard at the mercantile barely looked at her, sliding her meager purchases across the counter with a look of pure contempt. "Heard you've had company," Martha said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "A woman alone has to be careful, especially a woman with children." Maeve's face burned, but she said nothing. She grabbed her things and fled, the eyes of the whole town following her out the door. The sheriff was waiting for her at the fork in the road, his horse kicking restlessly at the snow. His face, usually so kind, was grim. "Maeve," he said, tipping his hat. "We need to talk." He didn't waste any time. "The talk's getting bad, Maeve. Folks are saying Boone Callahan is living up at your place. They're saying things ain't proper." Maeve's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. "He brought us food, Sheriff. We would have starved." The sheriff sighed, his breath a white cloud in the frosty air. "I know that, Maeve. And you know I don't hold with gossip. But the county men from the Capitol, they do. They listen to folks like Martha Pritchard." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, an official-looking document with a seal at the bottom. "This came for you," he said, his voice gentle. "It's a notice. The county is sending an agent to inspect your home, to assess the children's welfare." Maeve took the paper, her fingers numb. She unfolded it, and the words swam before her eyes. "Inadequate guardianship. Unsuitable environment. Ward of the county." They were coming in 1 week. 1 week to prove she was a fit mother. "If they find him there, Maeve," the sheriff said, his voice low and urgent, "or if they believe for 1 second that you're involved with a man like him, they'll take Hank and Rosie, and there won't be a thing I can do to stop it." He got on his horse and rode away, leaving Maeve standing alone in the middle of the road, the piece of paper fluttering in her hand. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a threat. The town wasn't just judging her. They were actively trying to take her children away. And she realized with a sickening lurch that this had nothing to do with her reputation. It was about Boone. Someone in that town was terrified of him, and they were using her children as a weapon to drive him away, or to silence him for good. That night the sky opened up. A blizzard descended on the mountains, a howling white fury that erased the world. The wind shrieked and clawed at the little cabin, and snow began to drift in through the cracks around the window. Maeve piled every blanket they had on the children, huddling close to them for warmth, listening to the storm rage outside. It was a prison of snow and ice. No one could get in, and no one could get out. By morning, the world was gone. There was only white. The snow was piled up to the roof, and the silence was absolute. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. And then she heard it, a small, weak cough from under the blankets. It was Rosie. Maeve touched her forehead, and a bolt of pure panic shot through her. Rosie's skin was on fire. Her eyes were glassy, and her breathing was shallow and fast. Fever, and a bad one. In the middle of a blizzard, miles from town, miles from any doctor. Maeve knew with a certainty that stole her breath that Rosie was dying. She tried everything she could think of. She melted snow and tried to get Rosie to drink. She put cold cloths on her forehead, but the fever kept rising. Rosie started to murmur deliriously, her small body thrashing under the blankets. Hank sat in the corner, his face pale with fear, watching his sister fade away. Maeve was frantic. She was losing her daughter. The town was buried. The doctor was an impossibility. There was no one, except him. The thought came to her like a desperate prayer. Boone. He lived in the woods. He knew things, herbs, remedies. He had to know something. But to go to him meant trudging through a blizzard that could kill her in minutes. And what if the sheriff was right? What if Boone was dangerous? She looked at Rosie, her breath coming in ragged little gasps, and the choice was gone. She would risk the storm. She would risk the devil himself to save her daughter. She pulled on her boots, wrapped her shawl tight around her head and shoulders, and pushed open the cabin door. The storm hit her like a physical blow, a wall of wind and ice that knocked her back a step. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her, but she knew the direction of the ridge. She knew the way his footprints had led. She took a deep breath, bent her head against the wind, and stepped out into the white hell, her daughter's name a silent scream on her lips. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore at her, and the snow was so deep it was like wading through quicksand. Every step was a battle. She fell again and again, the icy snow soaking through her clothes, but she always dragged herself back to her feet. She was guided by a blind, desperate hope, following the faint memory of a trail. The world was a howling, featureless void. She was about to give up, to let the snow take her, when she saw it. A faint, flickering light through the curtain of falling snow. Smoke. A chimney. She stumbled toward it, her legs screaming in protest, and collapsed against a solid wood door, pounding on it with her frozen fists. "Boone!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Please, help me!" The door was thrown open, and he was there, filling the doorway. He took one look at her, at the desperation on her face, and didn't ask a single question. "What is it?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "Rosie," Maeve gasped, sobbing. "The fever. She's she's dying." Higher. He grabbed his heavy coat and his pack without a word and followed her back out into the storm, his long, powerful strides breaking a path through the snow that she could barely follow. When they finally burst back into her cabin, he didn't waste a second. He stoked the fire until it was roaring and set a kettle of water to boil. He knelt beside Rosie, his large, rough hand gently touching her forehead. His face was grim. He pulled a small leather pouch from his pack and took out a handful of dried bark and herbs, crushing them in his palm. He mixed them into the boiling water, the strange, bitter smell filling the small cabin. "Willow bark," he said, not looking at Maeve. "It'll break the fever." He poured the dark liquid into a cup. "She won't keep it down," Maeve whispered, her voice choked with tears. "She will," Boone said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You hold her up. I'll get her to drink." For hours they fought for Rosie's life. Maeve held her daughter, whispering to her, while Boone patiently, gently, spooned the bitter medicine into her mouth, a drop at a time. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, time seemed to stand still. There was only the fire, the sound of Rosie's labored breathing, and the quiet, steady presence of this strange man. Finally, in the darkest hour before the dawn, it happened. The fever broke. The heat seemed to flow out of Rosie's body, leaving her drenched in sweat but cool to the touch. She sighed, a long, deep sigh, and fell into a natural, healing sleep. Maeve slumped against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. Boone sat across from her, staring into the fire, his face etched with shadows. After a long, long silence, he spoke, his voice so low she could barely hear him over the crackling flames. "I buried my wife," he said. "One winter just like this." Maeve looked at him, startled. His eyes were fixed on the fire, but she could see he was 1,000 miles away. "A fever took her, just like that, fast. By the time I could even think about writing for a doctor, the snow had us trapped." He paused, his throat working. "I didn't know then what I know now, about the willow bark, about the forest medicine." He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw a pain so deep it stole her breath. "I couldn't save her," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "but I could save yours." In that moment, everything shattered. The fear, the suspicion, the pride, all of it washed away by the raw, honest grief in his voice. She understood. The firewood, the venison. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a threat. It was atonement. He wasn't just helping her. He was saving himself from the ghosts of his past. Without thinking, Maeve reached across the small space between them and took his hand. His rough, calloused fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. And in the quiet of the snowbound cabin, with the storm finally beginning to die outside, Maeve Hollister realized she wasn't alone anymore. But with that comfort came a chilling new question. If this man was so good, so decent, why was the entire town so determined to destroy him? The storm passed, and the world was reborn in glittering gold and white. Boone was still there, splitting wood as if he'd always been a part of their lives. The air in the cabin had changed. It was filled not with fear, but with a quiet strength. That afternoon, as Rosie slept peacefully and Hank whittled a piece of wood Boone had given him, Maeve finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "Boone," she said, her voice soft, "why did you say my husband fought hard? What was he fighting?" Boone stopped his work, the axe resting by his side. He looked at the distant snow-covered ridge where the accident had happened. "He was fighting for you," he said finally, "for his family." He took a deep breath. Maeve, I was there that day. I was his logging partner. Maeve felt the floor shift beneath her feet. What? We worked for Pritchard's logging company, he went on, his voice low and heavy with memory. Your husband. Hank was the best, but he was honest. Too honest for a man like Pritchard. He explained that the equipment was old and poorly maintained. Ropes were frayed, axes were dull, and the logging carts were disasters waiting to happen. Hank had complained, not once, but dozens of times. He'd gone to Pritchard, the owner of the mercantile and nearly everything else in town, and told him someone was going to get killed. Pritchard had told him to keep his mouth shut or he'd be out of a job. The day of the accident, Boone said, his voice turning to gravel, the brake line on the cart snapped, just like Hank said it would. He looked at Maeve, his eyes filled with a terrible regret. It wasn't an accident, Maeve. It was murder. Sharam, the word hung in the air, cold and sharp as an icicle. Maeve felt dizzy, sick. Her husband hadn't just died. He had been killed. By greed. By indifference. Why didn't you say anything? She whispered, her voice trembling. I did, Boone said, a bitter edge to his words. I went straight to Sheriff Amos. I told him everything. I showed him where the brake line had been frayed for months. I told him what Pritchard had said to Hank. And what happened? Maeve asked, though she already knew the answer. Nothing, Boone said, spitting the word out like poison. Pritchard owns this town, Maeve. He owns the sheriff. He owns everyone. When I wouldn't back down, they started the rumors. That I was crazy, that I was violent, that I'd threatened Pritchard. They turned the whole town against me, made me into the monster on the mountain so that no one would ever listen to the truth. It all clicked into place. Martha Pritchard's cruelty, the town's cold stares, the sheriff's warning, the notice from the county. It wasn't about her. It was a conspiracy, a cover-up. They were trying to drive her out or discredit her, so the truth about her husband's death would stay buried forever. The county agent was due tomorrow. This was Pritchard's final move. He was going to use the law to take her children, scattering the last remnants of Hank Hollister's family to the wind, ensuring their silence. A cold, hard anger, the likes of which Maeve had never felt before, began to burn in her chest. They had taken her husband. They would not take her children. She looked at Boone, his face a mask of grim determination. They're not going to win, she said, her voice clear and strong. Tomorrow, when that county man comes, we're not going to hide. We're going to town, and we're going to tell him the truth. Boone looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, which was quickly replaced by a fierce, burning admiration. He nodded slowly. All right, Maeve, he said. We'll tell them the truth. The next morning, Maeve and Boone walked into town. They didn't stumble through the snow like victims. They walked side by side, their heads held high, two solitary figures against the vast white landscape. Hank and Rosie walked between them, holding their hands. When they pushed open the door to the mercantile, the room went silent. Every eye turned to them. Martha Pritchard was behind the counter, a smug look on her face. Beside her stood her husband, a large, fleshy man with small, piggy eyes. And next to him was Sheriff Amos, looking uncomfortable, and a thin, severe-looking man in a city suit, the agent from the county. Well, well, Mr. Pritchard said, his voice oily. Look what the storm blew in. I believe you were warned about this, Sheriff. The agent looked at Maeve, his face impassive. Ma'am, I'm Mr. Davies. I'm here to assess the living situation of your children. Before he could say another word, Maeve stepped forward. My children are fine, she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that startled everyone in the room. But my husband is dead, and I think you should know why. Pritchard laughed, a short, ugly sound. She's hysterical, sir. Grief does terrible things to a woman's mind. And this man, he said, pointing a fat finger at Boone, is a dangerous lunatic who's been filling her head with lies. He's not a liar, Maeve said, her eyes locked on Pritchard. My husband died because you were too cheap to fix a faulty brake line on your logging cart. He warned you, and you told him to be quiet. You killed him. A gasp went through the small crowd. Pritchard's face turned purple. That's a slanderous accusation. Sheriff, arrest this man for trespassing and this woman for insanity. Sheriff Amos took a hesitant step forward, but Boone held up a hand. "Before you do that, Sheriff," he said, his voice a low growl, "you might want to look at this." He reached into his coat and threw something onto the counter. It was a thick, frayed piece of metal cable, the broken brake line. "I pulled that from the wreckage myself," Boone said. "The day after I spoke to you, Amos. The day you told me to let it go." The sheriff's face went pale. Pritchard started to bluster, calling Boone a liar, a madman. But Boone wasn't finished. He reached into his coat again and pulled out a small, tarnished silver flask. "This was Hank's," he said, his voice softening. "He gave it to me the morning he died. He said he had a bad feeling." He unscrewed the top of the flask. It wasn't whiskey that he tipped out. It was a small, tightly folded piece of paper, stained with grease and dirt. He unfolded it carefully and laid it on the counter next to the brake line. "Hank wasn't a great writer," Boone said, "but he was a careful man." The note was short, written in a rough pencil scrawl. It detailed the date, the faulty equipment, and his conversation with Pritchard. It ended with a simple, heartbreaking sentence. "If anything happens to me, make sure Maeve knows it wasn't her fault." The room was dead silent. Mr. Davies, the county agent, picked up the note. He read it, then looked at the brake line. Then he looked at Mr. Pritchard's terrified, sweating face. And in that moment, the entire web of lies fell apart. Justice, it turned out, had just been waiting for the snow to clear. The Pritchards lost everything. The county agent's report was damning, and an investigation from the Capitol uncovered years of corruption and neglect. Their company was shut down, their wealth was seized, and they left town in disgrace. The town itself, shamed into action, began to change. People started leaving food on Maeve's porch, not out of charity, but as a quiet apology. Sheriff Amos, his conscience finally getting the better of him, resigned. Boone Callahan stayed. He helped Maeve fix the cabin, taught Hank how to track, and showed Rosie which wildflowers were safe to eat. He never spoke of his wife again, but the haunted look in his eyes began to fade, replaced by something new. Something like peace. They weren't a couple, not yet. But standing on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, Maeve looked at her two laughing children and the quiet, steady man standing beside her, and she knew deep in her bones that they were a family. They had faced the cold, the hunger, and the darkness, and they had come out the other side, stronger, together. "Not another day like this," she had once whispered into the cold, and she was right. There would never be another day like that again. If you were moved by Maeve's story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more incredible stories you won't find anywhere else.